Hello. Good evening, everyone. I think we're going to get underway. Thank you so much for being here. Everyone in the room, everyone online. Hello and welcome. Thanks so much. It's an incredible pleasure to welcome Anselm Berrigan. Thank you for being with us. Thank you all, and thank you all. For being here for this talk, Pregrettably Yours on Being Influenced, which is being delivered as part of the Bagley Wright Lecture Series on poetry, to say a bit about them, which supports contemporary poets as they explore in depth their own thinking on poetry and poetics, and give a series of lectures resulting from these investigations. Lectures are delivered publicly in partnership with institutions and organizations nationwide, and we've been grateful to be one such organization, first with Isaac Jarneau and now with Anselm, and hopefully maybe an ongoing capacity. So thank you to everyone at the Bagley Wright Lecture Series. Huge pleasure to be hosting this, and generally to partner with you all if you're out there somewhere. There are many books for sale, authored and edited by Anselm Berrigan, so, like a stack yay high probably is a good idea upon leaving. But pay for them first, preferably, I don't know, whatever. That helps. And then I'm just going to mention a couple of things that are coming up, and then we'll get on with it. So most immediately, tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Is our open mic, Resound Return, every last Friday of the month, typically. Bring some poems, dust some poems off, or maybe they don't have dust on them if they're fresh. Anytime that they were, it doesn't matter. Fresh, stale, bring them tomorrow, 7 p.m. And then our final 2 months of programming are nearly upon us, as it's almost April here in this location on Locust Street, and there is a lot happening. And I'm just going to name like a few things, but stay tuned via our print newsletter, website, etc. A lot going on, including a reading and workshop with Ed Werstein on April 11th, Milwaukee-based wonderful poet. A concert in our Formation series on April 16th at 7 p.m., featuring sets from Logain and Dawn S.K., and notably Hal Rammel and Linda Binder. Hal, who has curated the Alternating Currents live music series here for over 30 years. So lovely that he'll be able to perform before we leave this building. But that'll be a great show all around. A conversation between Anne Kingsbury and Deborah Bremer about this amazing exhibition, Art That Keeps On Singing, works by Anne Kingsbury. That's going to be April 25th at 2 p.m. And just generally come back and enjoy this. One more that I'll mention, and then there's but Abraham Smith and Steve Tim reading on April 30th, and that's just April, and that's not even all of April. So stay tuned. A lot's coming up, including mark your calendars for the entirety of the 22nd, 23rd, and 24th of May, because that whole weekend we're gonna have we're gonna say farewell in grand-ish style. Yeah, so be with us in April and May, and then beyond in our new building. And through the summer with Poetry in the Park. I'll stop now. There's a lot of stuff happening, and I want to tell you all about it. But we're here, not for that reason, tonight. Tonight we're here to hear from Anselm Berrigan, whose latest book of poetry, Don't Forget to Love Me, was published in September 2024 by Wave Books, and there are many other books he's authored, including Pregrets, Something for Everybody, and Come In Alone, among so many others. He is the editor of What is Poetry? Just kidding, I know you know. Interviews from the Poetry Project newsletter. Amazing collection. And co-author of 2 collaborative books, Loading with visual artist Jonathan Allen and Skasers with poet John Coletti. He was the poetry editor for the Brooklyn Rail from 2008 through 2023, and with Alice Notley and Edmund Berrigan co-edited the collected poems of Ted Berrigan and selected poems, and also edited Get the Money, collected prose of Ted Berrigan with Notley, Edmund Berrigan, and Nick Sturm. From 2003 to 2007, he was the artistic director of the Poetry Project at St. Mark's Church. He teaches writing classes at Pratt, Brooklyn College, and was longtime co-chair in writing at the Milton Avery Graduate School of the Arts interdisciplinary MFA program. Of Anselm Berrigan's poems, Anne Waldman has said, quote, "Sometimes I'm breathless inside a language barrage or barrel, speedily turning, not bound by any one thought. Other times I'm with abandon in the cognition quotidian soup." But she tells us, consciousness is a vivid Zen equalizer. In the equalizing consciousness, something we all share in common, but also that each individual consciousness shares space with so many others, is composed of them. And this seems a space in which Berrigan's poems frequently move. Through conversation, memory, anecdote, so many references, familiar names, and dedications, all alive in the influx of flux, the inflowing of all those other lives concomitant in the poem. And across many books, there's a proliferation of forms, couplets, poems flushed to the margin or sprawling across the field of the page, paragraphs, framed sentences that turn upon themselves, and so very much more. There's also an embodied momentum across the surfaces of the poems, whether through physical reality, say as a pedestrian, for instance, moving through the world, or through the reality of the page and its swarm of language, quote, inviting illegibility, borrowing here from Berrigan, from to, quote, the mean driveways of the country. The poem itself becomes a kind of extension of life and a social occasion, a nexus, crossroads or commons, all of this seemingly mirroring, quote, the too muchness of the world, wholly avoiding closure or any knowing finality. It's all a continuous onrushing of shared experience, or to borrow again from Waldman, it's, quote, a syncretic piling on, as words jump the gate, rhapsodize, list, lumber, scan this wild existence. Please, a huge, huge welcome for Anselm Berrigan.
Thank you, Mike. What is this? Okay. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I was supposed to be here in October, and I picked a fight with a sidewalk and lost by a lot. But I'm happy to be able to get the chance to come back. I'm gonna read this talk, which is called Pregrettably Yours, on being influenced. I was invited to write a talk by the folks at Wave Books, and they asked me to send them a paragraph they asked what I would want to write about, so I put together a paragraph and said, well, I could write about this, 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 and this. And they said, well, that sounds like a bunch of talks, so why don't you do the lectureship? So I wrote this first over a period of time. And so the first, I'm going, am I loud enough? Can you hear me? Can all you Zoom fuckers out there hear me? Sorry. I like to pick on audience members that aren't actually here. So, I decided I would try and write this first lecture/talk. I have to say talk to get through it on what my experience of being influenced has been. So this is not an analysis of what influence is, it's a relay of how I think influence has happened for me and maybe an embodiment of that happening. Now, I'm not sure I know what that means exactly, the embodiment part. I'm trying to write out from having been influenced rather than into a description of what I think influence might be. And so this lecture takes place in 3 sections. And the first has to do with growing up as part of a family of poets, my brother, my father, my mother, and my stepfather, the British poet and writer Douglas Oliver. The second section has to do with listening to people talking, mostly. And then the third section, in the talk, in the third section, I read some poems from the book that Mike mentioned, Don't Forget to Love Me, mainly from the first section of that book, and then I talk about how those are specifically influenced by specific writers mostly. But my mother died about 10 months ago, and so I have this piece that in some versions of giving this talk, I switch out the third section in order to read this other piece that is sort of trying to begin to handle her death. And so I'm going to read that tonight instead of the third section. And I'll just start. This is dedicated to the poet Cedar Saigo, who gave me a bunch of tips and advice on how to do this, most of which are useful. And this section is called Family Business. Cedar asked me to talk about my first poem, so that's how this has to begin. I wrote my first poem in 5th grade, sometime between the autumn of 1982 and spring 1983. A poet, possibly from Teachers and Writers Collaborative, a still extant Poets in the Public Schools program, founded and built upon by many writers, came by our classroom at PS 19 on 11th Street, 1st Avenue in New York City one afternoon. She had us read William Carlos Williams' The Red Wheelbarrow. I don't remember what she said about the poem. I do, for some reason, always think it's the chickens that are glazed instead of the wheelbarrow. But I also remember she asked us to write a poem with breaks and triplets, 3-line stanzas, a kind of step down, that had to begin with Williams' opening line, "So much depends upon." And she asked us to think of an early memory, something almost out of reach. It was kind of amazing, because I was like 9 or 10, right? That we could put in the poem following that first line. I flashed to a set of 3 tiny plastic biplanes I remembered from our time in Chicago, where I was born, and where we lived mostly until I was 4, before we moved to New York. Pink, yellow, and green with a landing lane. Maybe I slant-rhymed plane and lane. I did the task. The poet read the poem, which I'd written quickly, and she whispered to me that it was good. I may or may not have taken it home to show anybody. The next poem arrived a little more than 10 years later. Walking the relatively dumb halls of PS 19, I remember walking past a classroom that was the room for kids 1 year behind me. Maybe I was in 4th grade and they were in 3rd, and there was a big piece of paper pasted by the door with the heading, "What Our Parents Do," meaning what jobs they had. I don't remember any of the jobs listed except poet. There were about 6 or 7 of them. It was Marie Warsh's class, the older daughter of poets Louis Warsh and Bernadette Mayer. The jobs were all presented as on the same level. Being a poet was therefore ordinary. Our parents being poets was part of the common fabric of the neighborhood, the school, the blocks we lived on, the city at large. In writing a poem at school, I did something anyone might do as far as I could tell, if I even thought about it at all after writing the poem. And I didn't think about the poem again until years later, in San Francisco, trying to handle some hard family information, another unexpected death, and keep writing. I was working on a series of short poems, all called Ghost Town, with encouragement from Kevin Killian, who knew a few things about serial work. Kevin heard me read from the ongoing series and said, "Keep going." Those first few lines came back to me and became the next poem. I have to move around in time to do this. Dad is gone a year after writing that first poem. I have the same teacher for the next grade who, believing she knows me and my family, tortures me emotionally. After berating me in front of the class for refusing her first day fantasy of getting everyone in a boarding school, she pulls me into the hallway and peppers me with questions, finally concluding with, "Didn't your father let himself die? Wasn't that a dumb thing for such a smart man to do?" I never want to be a good student again. I never read poems at school or at home. I hear them. I'm not against them. I hear my mother read a few times when she starts giving readings again out of town from what would turn into her book At Night the States. I hear Clark Coolidge and Simon Pettit read in a barn in the Berkshires under pounding rain. I take in voice, tenor, tone, and texture and understand it still as a thing humans might do without judgment, but that's all. Eddie, my younger brother, Edmund Berrigan, by 2 years, starts writing poems when he's 8. It's fun for him. He writes lots of short poems filled with stuffed animals and sodas and names of things and some collaborations with our mother. His sense of humor and ear for detail are somehow already available to the poems. He publishes, or has published for him, several staple-bound books called things like Dinosaur and Half Past. No shit. You can find at least one of these in the rare books room of the New York Public Library. I pay little attention. He gets invited to read at the Poetry Project on a Monday night by Barbara Barg for the Younger Poets series in 1982. Incidentally, 16 years later, I'll be hired by Ed Friedman to organize and host the Monday night series at the Poetry Project. He stays with it, gets more into it, buys the collected Dylan Thomas on his own, while also beginning to mercilessly listen to everything Bob Dylan has ever done, and gets another reading at the project in 1987 when he's 13. I wasn't originally on the schedule, but Richard Hell called me because he was in a bind, Eddie told me recently. I'm sitting in the parish hall, age 15, laughing at some of his lines. A hen speaking from heaven in a poem called Hen World says, 2 sets of wings and I still can't fly. In one line, he's taken care of spirituality, animist persona work, and the hen afterworld's possible continuance of existential angst. That's just a lot of bullshit. I thought it'd be funny to say. I die repeatedly from muffled laughter, the kind you can't stop because you're trying to stop, in public, while sitting next to Lita Hornick. Lita founded Culture Press and Magazine, stewarding many amazing works into the world, including Bean Spasms, the collaborative book of poems by my father and Ron Padgett. She's inimitable, intimidating, and raspy-voiced. Sometimes she shows up on St. Mark's Place in a limo to take Mom and Doug to dinner at fancy restaurants that have exotic animals on the menu. Eddie's work is funny enough to distract me from the fact that sitting next to her somewhat freaks me out. At the break, after Eddie's done, Lita turns to me and asks, in her Barosian fire voice, "So, what are you good at, Anselm?" I run, is what I say. I had nothing else to say. I was on my high school's track team and beginning a mild form of self-resurrection after the death of our sister Kate, run down by a motorcycle on Houston Street a few months earlier. Summer of 1989, 16 going on 17, working as a foot messenger after finishing high school and closing in on leaving home for college in Buffalo, I start reading around in So Going Around Cities by Dad, Ted Berrigan, his big red hardcover selected in New Poems from Blue Wind Press, 1981, I think. End up honing in on Last Poem. It's totally affecting, a self-elegy, written naturally before death, and I'm bowled over by the power and performance of the last line, "Let none regret my end who called me friend." The unusual sense of permission that gives me to sense I can replace the shock of his removal from life with, seemingly to me at 10, no warning, with another kind of feeling, that maybe he was prepared to cut out, and this shit, life, could be all right. He wasn't prepared. But the language he made to be music could wear the costume of saying to me later that it was all right. Turned out, last poem was a type of form for Dad. He was interested in certain forms that were not so much about the physical shape or constraint other forms might take on, but were bound up with a situation. His poem, People Who Died, for instance. Anyone after some duration of living can write a poem listing their people who've died. It's a way of thinking of form as based on experience and maybe event. The event of the writing and the experience summoned as bound up together into a record that is a poem. And so anyone might write a poem called Last Poem and feel their way through a tonal space meant to make an environment steeped in the premonition of finality, a test of one's emotional intelligence, maybe, though it doesn't have to be. In college, I thought I might become a journalist as a way to make money, but I didn't like calling people, and I didn't like generating the bulk descriptive language necessary to pad the apparent facts. I thought I might be a music writer for a while, but describing other people's stuff wasn't enough. I tried writing very short stories for what was called the Fourth Column, an open writing space in the Prodigal Son, the entertainment insert in the University of Buffalo's student-run newspaper. The Sun came out weekly. The paper itself came out 3 times per week in an edition of 13,000. I co-edited The Sun for 2 years. That led to keeping a notebook, but it didn't take long, less than a year, for me to figure out I wasn't so interested in things like plot, character, plot logic, or themes. I cared about words and their sounds and sequences, which felt like an infinite well, and the ways people might talk, all these things that could get me away from my compositional wiring, which was predicated on sense as a received thing. One afternoon in late April or early May of 1991, I broke a line in my notebook instead of letting it continue across the page into a sentence and felt an immediate full-body high, or rush, or buzz containment suit all over, and I said out loud to myself, shit. Knowing I was now in it, centered, hooked, bound, and relieved, thrust into some internal wilder thing. Summer of 1991, I'm living and working in Buffalo and writing poems or poem-like things in a notebook. On a phone call, I tell my mother I've started writing poems. She seems startled, or at least I register a pause. I take a break from work and life at a house called The Ranch, and the one of millions of housemates and house guests who call me Anton because Anselm doesn't come out of their mouths right. Eventually, a revolving door of nicknames ensues. Ralton, Leston, Selmton, Taunton, Selm, Workton, Fuckton, Cunton, and on, depending on the situation I am being observed in. I bring a little sheaf of short poems, all in irregular forms. I sit on the bed in our living room, which is also a couch, because everything in our small apartment has to have at least 2 functions, while first Mom, then Doug read through the poems. Mom starts asking me questions while she reads. I think she asks me how I start, where the words come from, what happens as the poem continues. Never having been asked questions about writing poems, I don't have any idea how my answers sound, but my answers seem to be a string of clauses coming out of my mouth and expanding, and I'm surprised by them and interested that I can even talk about it. Without even looking up at me, still looking at the poems, Mom asked Doug, can there be a whole family of poets? Doug searches his largely self-taught encyclopedic writer mind and deadpan summons some either partial and or obscure possible examples. The inference seems to be it's happening. Okay, let's go get some tacos. Sometime in 1992, on a brief visit back to New York City, having read Samuel Beckett for the first time in a class on experimental fiction at UB taught by Raymond Fetterman, I reread Last Poem and I'm slightly startled by the line, I once had the honor of meeting Beckett and I dug him. Dad met Beckett. How do I not know this? I ask Mom about this line and she starts laughing and says, that's just something Bob Creeley said. Ted just thought it worked there in the poem. Speaking of Buffalo, I took no creative writing classes there. The poetics program was in full effect at the time with Creeley, Susan Howe, Charles Bernstein, Jack Clark, Dennis Tedlock, and a lot of other terrific faculty, and I would later discover that I was an undergrad when a lot of future friends and fellow poets were there. But I was devoted to the newspaper, and I just didn't have room to take something like Charles's Wednesday at 4 class, because that was deadline day. And I wasn't writing in any confident way in terms of poems. It was all mostly private, and didn't feel certain enough to take one of Susan's writing classes and deal with whatever pressure I sensed might be there. And Bob only taught one undergrad class the whole time I was there on autobiography and prose, which baffled me, so I didn't take it. I did take one class focused on Milton my senior year, taught by Professor Millie Clark. I enjoyed it a great deal, though I still wasn't sure I always knew what Milton was talking about, because I didn't. And then I took a class my junior year on modern American poetry taught by Stacy Hubbard. That, along with the Milton class, was my other deliberate decision to try and get to know some more poets while in college. Professor Hubbard, who I took at least one more class with, had us read Whitman, Dickinson, Williams, Stevens, Hughes, Bishop, Brooks, Moore, I think, and then jumped ahead at the end of the semester and had us read My Life by Lynn Aginian. I could be leaving someone out. And while she talked about Kenneth Koch and Frank O'Hara on the first day, we bypassed the whole of Don Allen's New American Poetry Anthology. Not that I knew about that yet, and also, by the way, I don't care that we did. Whitman I was somewhat familiar with from an American Lit class taught by my freshman year by Ted Pelton, the novelist who teaches now in Tennessee. Everyone else was unknown. Emily Dickinson blew my mind because I felt like her poems sounded like parts of my mind, and I wrote 2 short papers on her poems feeling like I had no idea what I was talking about, and Professor Hubbard responded positively to both of them in ways that truly surprised me. I didn't realize I was thinking by not knowing what I was talking about. Later, when I thought I understood Langston Hughes, Professor Hubbard told me, "No, you don't," and she was right. Stevens' poems seemed to me to be immobile. I wouldn't have put it that way back then, but later I realized that not responding to Stevens positively was a way of letting his poems get in and do some work. Williams seemed cool, for lack of a better way of putting it, but based on what little I knew then about Williams and poetry, I remember thinking, this is speech? Really? Is it all just locked away in the attic? If you happen to have a fucking house? And at some point, I started making a distinction for myself between speech as an academic term and talk, which I experienced by talking with and being talked to. Lynn's book was a total hook, and I grew to admire the way Professor Hubbard jumped forward several decades to bring it in at the end. That doesn't even get into the fact that My Life is a total undercut of the word on the imaginary street in the 90s, that the language writers abided by the no I in team theory of autobiography. Cut ahead about 8 years, I'm living in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, still cheap then, back in the Stone Age, late 90s. Been writing poems continuously, have a body of work I'm building on, and am furiously exposing myself to other people's work through reading, conversation, going to readings, organizing and hosting readings, writing anonymous book reviews for Publishers Weekly, helping friends with their magazines, and getting more and more involved with the Poetry Project at St. Mark's Church. And one night alone in my and Greg Fuchs' multicolored ramshackle railroad flat, these questions hit me. How did I know how to do certain things when I started writing poems? How did I know to get off the margin right away and out into space? That it was okay to be funny, to not fret about hinges and logic, to feel free to take material from anywhere, including out of people's mouths. Right. I started reading my dad's poems as a teenager to get to know him, and a lot of the shapes and tones and particular amusements he worked with bled back in and gave me a seed of internal permission. And why would I notice? This was several years before I started writing. I was learning ahead of my conscious head. I moved to San Francisco in early '94 because I had a sense you could be a poet there, and moving back to New York City didn't feel right. On the last full day I spent in Buffalo, Bob Creeley took me to lunch and gave me a piece of paper with a list of names and phone numbers of folks he said I could reach out to if I needed help. The only name I recognized was Joanne Kiger. Don't think I called anyone on the list, mostly out of shyness, though I wasn't too shy to not give my poems to poets I didn't really know. Bob, who became a friend, read some poems of mine and said, you know, there's a difference when you say river in one poem and in another poem where you actually name a river. I still don't know exactly what I think that means in terms of how he put it to me, but it felt significant. Everything I hear and remember hearing begins to feel like influence. I might need to talk about the difference between influence and permission. They overlap, but they're not necessarily the same thing, at least in this parlance. Maybe I am doing that right now. June Jordan, after giving a reading at a small bookstore on Valencia Street in SF, that I can't remember the name of right now, in 1994, weeks after my arrival to that town, gets asked if she has any advice for young writers. She says, read everything, figure out what you like, imitate what you like. Instant affirmation and permission. And later I start repeating her advice while adding, it might be interesting to imitate what you think you don't like. Sitting in SF again, early spring 94, having hardly read anything, at least I thought so, staring at a copy I'd picked up of Bob Creeley's collected poems, 1946 to 1976, and feeling the weight of not knowing anything about poems, well, I said to myself, if this shit's as good as it's supposed to be, it'll be that good if I read it tonight or don't get to it for another 30 years. Somehow, that private articulation amused me enough to open the book and go in and read around without that initial anxiety. Other anxieties could come and go, as it turned out, around reading, but that form of anxiety around not knowing never came back. 2, hearing voices. Lewis Warsh said in an interview about his sentence line by sentence line poems, which make up the entirety of his book Origin of the World and otherwise show up scattered across his books published during the last 25 years of his life, the art is in the arrangement, meaning he'd write and collect these line sentences across time, and when he felt he had enough, he'd sit down to make a work out of arranging them. Maybe he did them standing. I don't know. I took and take that phrase, the art is in the arrangement, seriously. I told him once a poem of mine he'd heard me read and told me after the reading he dug it was influenced by these poems of his, and he said in some moment of pleasure and embarrassment, awkwardly, those are totally ADHD poems. May Bersenbrugge said when I asked her about her long lines, where do they come from? And I felt like I might be asking too plain a question, but asked anyway, because fuck it, I wanted to know. Her long lines that seem always spaced to me the same way Lewis's lines are spaced, double-spaced, as they say, but thereby set off into page space as sequential, but nonetheless independent entities, being themselves and part of the whole thing at the same time, which is something Joe Brainerd noted about how a collage has to work in his diaries, which my father read when Joe wasn't around, when they lived together briefly in the early 60s. May said, I live on a mesa most of the time in New Mexico, and there's a 360-degree horizon around me every day, and that's where the long line comes from. As I mentioned earlier, I took no writing classes in high school or college. I just wrote for the student paper in college, which was writing. I got to understand collage and stealing, but I didn't understand imitating. Now I think I understand imitating, and I do it whenever imitation feels available, because you can't imitate anyone without being and becoming yourself, in poems anyway. Also helps to avoid torturing yourself into thinking you have to be original. One night in my room at 617 Oak Street in San Francisco, I deliberately wrote a poem that was an imitation of what I thought then George Oppen might be doing tonally. I'm irritated right now that autocorrect keeps trying to change Oppen to open. I lived with the poem for a while, meaning I carried it around with the other poems I was working on, and it seemed like me, but without enough vocabulary, and way before I decided couplets are disjunction's secret weapon. I imitated Marianne Moore, doing a poem with a specific syllable count that worked by stanza, across several stanzas. That felt like an odd, low-intensity workout, which is not meant as an insult to Marianne Moore, even if she was some version of a Mets fan. The counting didn't sync up with my own writing rhythms at the time, which were too physical and choppy to fit into syllabics. Wave Books, for some inexplicable reason, decided to agree to publish a set of poems I wrote in the form of rectangles. The poems in the book are actually variations of the originals, because I wrote the originals at the very edge of the page, and you can't replicate that in a normatively bound book, so I maintained some delusion that I can sell the originals eventually for art world type money. This is in a notebook like this size, right? So I'd do this. Writing those poems was the most impractical and pleasurable writing experience. They seemed to have no future. They were getting rid of all these things poems normally have, like line breaks, stanzas, and movement across the page. The page space was contained by the poem, and when I got all the way around, the poem ended and suddenly there was no beginning or ending. There were loops. I wrote them being influenced by having 3 or 4 part-time jobs and 2 young children, and not a lot of time. Those poems could be written fast, heavily dosed by music, all the music I've ever loved. And then on the inside by Fred Moten's poems in his book, B. Jenkins, the book where every title is the name of someone he loves. I was learning how to talk about that book by getting students wherever I was teaching to read the poems aloud with me, and then talking about the experience of reading them aloud and where that seemed to go. Fred talks about where performances go when they're done. Doug Oliver, my stepfather, wrote to me and said, when you read a poem to yourself, not out loud, that's a performance of the poem too. Gradually, these observations shook me into taking them very seriously, the same way May's answer is a reminder that plain questions can lead to amazing answers. When I started writing poems, I was spending more time listening to music than reading poems. I wanted my poetry. At some point in San Francisco, I decided to work the way I thought certain songs by Sonic Youth worked. Start in a recognizable structure, gradually or suddenly collapse that structure, go through the collapse, and then put it back together into some other state. Other times I wanted the poems to flow uninterrupted, unpunctuated, totally susceptible to whatever was happening, the way I heard certain rappers sometimes. I'm talking more about Q-Tip and Chuck D now than anyone contemporary. I made a little poem in SF entirely out of lines from Pavement lyrics. I will say, I think now, I wished then they got a little more personal in some of their songs, but I was wrong. Frank O'Hara made writing poems feel possible. He'd made me want to write reading him, and then I knew my dad studied him closely, so reading his poems meant learning more about my dad's mind. That's its own trip. But I've always wanted to make music. My stepfather and mother used to talk together until he died in 2000 about other poets' work in terms of their music, shorthand for prosody, but also a way of separating from the potential academic aspect of the term. I have more respect for what I think prosody is than I can articulate at the moment. My stepfather's influence on me is so meaningful, I have to write something wholly other and else to give it further definition beyond anything that gets said here. And this is a little subsection called Friends and Neighbors. Leroy. Uh-huh. Old Alice. Will you carry my bags upstairs, Antoine? I'll give you $25. Just leave them in front of the door. Dolphy. What's up, chump? That's what they say to 7-year-olds walking down the street. Said it to my brother all the time, too. He's a nice guy. Lawrence, yelling up to our 3rd floor window, can Anselm come down and play? Molly, never ask a woman her age. Bobby, in the 2nd grade in Boulder, Colorado, I see you scratching your ass, Anselm. Young Ho, 6th grade graduation, unbuttoning the lower button on my jacket. First time I'm ever wearing a suit, courtesy of John Godfrey. Ain't you got any class? John Godfrey, last month. I'm really getting on my own nerves lately. Charlotte, you need to write a poem about me murdering everyone in the bar. She's a bartender. Charlotte, I don't understand your poems, except when I read them out loud. Then I think maybe I understand them. Unknown person in Las Vegas after reading Pointing at Me in 1995. You're a language poet. Later I find out that either Ron Silliman or Bob Perlman said if anyone accuses you of being a language poet, you are one. As the painter Willem de Kooning supposedly said, you're in a group whether you like it or not. I gave this talk in Philadelphia about 6 months ago, and Ron Silliman was actually there, and he came up and was talking to me. He was very friendly, and then he said goodbye, walked away, and then he turned around and he said, "You are a language poet." Okay. Me, Dad, what's a dude? Dad, a dude is a guy on the corner wearing a red sweater. No elaboration. Etel Adnan, circa 2005, we need a new Bob Dylan. Kamal Brathwaite, in his own bio, which I read by way of introducing him at the Poetry Project one Wednesday night, Kamal Brathwaite is a janitor of dreams. John Ashbery, after the one time we read together, I think you've been influenced by Sarah Palin. Accusingly and jokingly, I think, because I was dropping my G's at the ends of ing words during the reading. Mom, your Jim Brodey poems are good, but they don't have his Slurpee quality. Me, what? Mom, Jim wanted to lick everybody. Allen, this is Allen Ginsberg, pointing to some lines in one of my poems. No one will ever understand that. Me, to myself, well, if I find one person who does, that's no longer true. So maybe that's my new standard for understanding. Find one person who understands, or says they understand. Drug Dealer 1 or 1000, circa 1988, looks like he got a haircut. Drug Dealer 2, he should have got his head cut. Drug Dealer 1, another day watching me run. You need to work on extending your stride. Philip Whalen, on hearing Jim Brodey slept with Frank O'Hara. That's like sleeping with George Washington. Franz Klein, to be right is the most terrific personal state that nobody's interested in. Leslie Scalapino, this man on the NEA panel argued angrily against everyone I advocated for. Philip Whalen, you should have slapped him with your beaded handbag. Allen, on hearing I loved Whalen's poems excitedly, do you understand them? Allen always claimed that he didn't understand Philip's poems, but he always smiled when he said that. Allen, on hearing the beaded handbag story, also excitedly, that's what we used to say to each other in the 50s about people who were assholes. Charlotte, a different Charlotte, you told me to read the last poem in your book first, so why didn't you put that poem first? Me, I thought you might like the book better if you read that poem first. Allen, unprompted, do you want to know what first thought, best thought really is? It's not about not editing. Me, sure. Allen, here's what first thought, best thought is really about. You have a picture in your mind. The picture leads you to the words. It's not about not revising. It's about coming back to and through that picture to find words. Me, do you ever let words take you to the picture? Allen, no, I'm not that smart. Mom, on the phone from Paris, me, Evan, relayed this conversation. That's the generation gap. So this is Allen Ginsberg I'm talking about. Allen was not long to live when I was in a tutorial with him through Brooklyn College. Tutorial just meaning we met 7 times to talk about my work during the fall 1996 semester, though I often wanted to talk to him more about other writers' work, the writers he loved, as I was feeling displaced that fall, having moved back to New York from San Francisco and having a heavily disrupted sense of confidence in my writing. He knew it, and that he was dying, and several times told me he valued literal clarity in poems. I had and often still have to begin with words and their sounds free of constraint, including the demand or pressure of immediate and assumed or expected literal clarity in order to get anywhere in the immediate present as now. My version of clarity is born from no plan. Allen, on A Moment in This Lime Tree Bower, My Prison by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, which we were reading together to help me figure out how to write a paper on the poem, and Puzzled by STC slipping into a thy. I wonder why I did that. Renee Gladman, from a transcription in an issue of Thuggery and Grace, I'm paraphrasing. When I read the work of someone who's doing things I'm not used to or haven't encountered before, I ask myself, what is it that makes this person relate to language this way? Right. Why not be curious by work that feels baffling or wild or bizarre or all of the above and therefore something else? N. Lauterbach. Revision means seeing again. It doesn't have to mean making changes. Eddie. Your music is clunky. Me. What? Eddie. It's not a bad thing. It's just clunky. That's your music. 1995. Another night around the same time, I'm talking to Eddie with exuberance and excitement about poetry, and Eddie goes silent. I say, what's up? Eddie's response, with a tinge of the agonist coming forward, you don't understand. I've been doing this for 13 years. He's 21. I'm 23. Possible lecture title, On Influence, the Only Racket That Matters. I'm sitting with Allen at the Me Noodle Shop on First Avenue doing one of our tutorial meetings one evening. John Godfrey, poet and longtime neighbor of Allen's at 437 East 12th Street, walks in, and Allen asks if we should invite him to sit with us. I am a fan of John's poems and have known him since I was a kid. And know he's probably just gotten off his long hours demanding job of being a nurse driving around Brooklyn treating HIV-positive children at their homes. He's rarely free, and I say, yes, please invite him. John's happy to sit with us and surprised, in an honored way, when Allen asks me if we should get John's feedback on the poem of mine we were talking about. Allen occasionally told me he thought my poems were sophisticated, and I felt like I had to decide if that was a compliment or not. When I heard someone else, probably Bob Rosenthal, tell me Allen told him my poems were sophisticated, I decided he meant it as a good thing, though I wasn't sure I knew what sophisticated meant, and I sure as hell didn't feel sophisticated in any way. The poem was something I wrote after hearing that a SF-based poet, Daniel Davidson, had committed suicide. I'd only met Dan a few times, but a lot of my older friends back there were very close with him, and I knew they were taking it hard. I felt far away from what was starting to feel like a home I shouldn't have left, even though I still knew leaving was the right decision. Allen has already made some marks on the poem, and John takes a pencil, reads the poems, makes some light slashes and suggestions here and there. Explaining his suggestions, John says something like, I like to make cuts and breaks that add some mystery to the flow. Allen looks up from his soup and says something like, I don't know if I agree with that, with gentle vehemence. Conversation ensues, but that exchange tells me all I need to know. I ended the poem with the line, bullshit is a star. John liked that line. I think I didn't take any of their suggestions, but I also never published the poem. It had an urgency that was honestly felt, but I didn't know Dan well enough to give him that kind of space. At a certain point, I wanted to surrender to influence. Maybe that's a bit dramatic, actually. I'm not sure it's true, but it sounds good, and that's a problem. But maybe one I'm willing to solve, or maybe it's just always there, influence, and that's the rub, and talking about it might interrupt the flow. Influence is flow, I mean. It's so damn fun now to be influenced, except for when it's horrifying and you become an open nerve ending and the shit doesn't stop flowing. But that dramatic trauma leaves out the reality of intermittence that made Roland Barthes feel crazy after his mother died. See R.B.'s Morning Diary. Grief hits you when it decides to hit you, and you don't get to have the kind of control continuity promises, or maybe also the end continuity seems to promise. He writes about it beautifully. I wasn't sure I should be reading his notes on Mourning, since they were published after his death and were basically a set of index cards someone else decided to publish. But then they dovetailed with the way Nathaniel Dorsey, the filmmaker, writes about intermittence in his book, which was a talk, Devotional Cinema, wherein he wonders aloud whether or not our solidity and even our seeing aren't intermittent. He says, on close examination, even our vision appears to be intermittent, which explains why, in film, pans often feel artificial or forced. This stems from the fact that one never pans in real life. In truth, when we turn our heads, we don't actually see a graceful continuum, but a series of tiny jump cuts, little stills joined perhaps by infinitesimal dissolves. Title, On Being Influenced, a lecture by a sucker. But, and then, what are you reading, and by reading, admitting to your mind? And leaving shit out is then what? Is the dysfunctional word. Saying things, no just. There's a way to bypass influence by ignoring it, and another way by totalizing it. Everything in, of, from, and around language is a point of influence. When de Kooning says about painting, content is a glimpse, it's very tiny. He's talking about sensory influence, how what you're seeing can be let in because it's already being let in and put there. We understand this psychologically, maybe, but when Amy Silman writes, I leave the studio because I'm hung up on how to finish a painting, and I see some pigeons being flown against a patch of pink in the sky, bingo, I know how to finish. If you live with and look at and listen to pigeons, you are being influenced by pigeons. They become another source, one of millions, if you don't get too anxious about it all. Language is a shared and constantly changing invention. It is a body-based technology that alienates and attracts the fuck out of everyone while being the source of total sonic specificity and insanity. I should stop now, but you know which ways of saying things are your versions of either copping out from or coming onto a particular situation. I decided to have a belief that any time I see a cormorant, it's a good day. Doesn't matter when in the day or what's already happened. Not sure I've ever seen a cormorant at night. This has to do with writing during the COVID pandemic lockdown phase under the Brooklyn Bridge, texting voice messages of poem reading back and forth with John Coletti, and watching cormorants fly and dive and fish, and sometimes land on a rock or a piece of pier and spread their wings to dry. They have turquoise eyes. Anytime a cormorant shows up in a poem of mine, it means I'm writing by a body of water, and I just got made happy. Why would I want to make this hard for anyone else to do? Dad liked to say, fuckface, mother raper, go fuck a duck, and jack off. Every kid I knew on the block swore unbelievably. So that's the end of the second section, and then I'm going to read this poem to finish, if you're all still there. And this is a poem, but I consider it maybe a talk, maybe an extension of this talk, maybe a coda. I don't know. If I can actually finish these talks and they can be a book, then this will be in it, I think. There's one thing I say in here that is totally wrong, but I'm not going to stop and footnote it, but I'll tell you afterwards if you want to know. It's called, What is the Purpose of a Guinea Hen? I didn't have a bug on my back, but I did bring 2 dog ticks to New York from Vermont recently. You know how some words are dysfunctional? Literally is one of them. You think you're being emphatic saying that literally happened, but it would be of greater strength and acuity to say that happened, even if you're not especially fond of reserve. This could be said to be a matter of character, such as you are in your own works and their days. We would like to think all doctors, having taken the Hippocratic Oath, will be good at their jobs, the tasks of which at hand are many, as with poets. But I've had bad doctors and good doctors, and the difference is not hard to suss out. Pain will make you understand who's good at their job. You don't want your doctor being a 55%er when it comes to attention to your physical particulars. I had one surgeon have to sew up my hernias 2 times, and somehow the jobs didn't take. I don't know if he was good or bad. Sometimes it's all genetics, which feels like a cop-out, whatever that is. See you later, officer. You will just have these holes opening up in your belly, and that's that. Call us when the next one opens and your intestine starts poking through again. Okay. The French medical system is more humane than the American system. That is, in fact, true. Mainly because the French take money mostly out of the system's equation for you, and Americans aren't taught how to understand the practicality of such separation. That doesn't mean there aren't expenses. When our mother died recently, we had to pony up 3,200 euros for cremation, a casket, and an urn. Do you want flowers? Nah. Do you guys want music? Nah, dude. You get 30 minutes in a room to do a ceremony. Okay? Do you want to project any images? No. Do you want to come to the hospital and ride in the car with the casket to Père Lachaise? No. We'll take the metro. It'll be faster. The undertaker got it. We wanted to read some poems, keep it plain, and keep the cost down. But the hospital bill, after a month of her being there, and a surgery to remove one of her kidneys, and a biopsy, and endless scans and tests and shot and morphine near the end we didn't see coming, when her neuropathy pain was overwhelming, but not enough that we couldn't keep talking about the pain, the music, the poems, our family, our friends, the state of the world as we fought to understand it, our stupid country and all its qualities, our humor, plus regular meals 3 times a day. She said they weren't bad when she could keep the food down, and kind and well-trained nurses on hand at all points, mostly. No bill. Everything was handled as a matter of ordinary course. Alice never stopped talking with anyone near her. 2. Midway through the path of this poem, maybe I had to combine a dump with a dive. That's realism for you dumbasses out there. I left home for college in 1989 and thought maybe, I don't know, folks would be more civilized attending university in Buffalo. Nope. Ended up living with dudes who maybe have changed their ways or rehabilitated somehow since then, but man, they were so fucked up and wrong about so many things, I'm not even sure I should even put them here. Like, you know how there are slurs that don't get used with any reclamation? Words so vile in their application towards the degradation of humanity, they can't even be in songs or used with complexity, which some folks might even call irony, but you don't know what that is. And yes, I'm a bitch, but here we are, afraid of words again. And I know you're there, so suck it up, audience. No one says the G word, right? Maybe some do, away from these ears as and not like. Anyway, these guys enjoyed casual hatred so much I had to say, hey, you know, what the fuck? And they were like, oh, you called us on our shit. And I was like, well, it hurts. I was trying to gambit. And they said, huh, but oh, you think you're better than us. And I was like, wait, no, maybe. And so they doubled up and tripled up. Imagine, and you can imagine. As soon as someone says, I can't imagine, you know somewhere they're shutting down. Imagine living with 3 potheads getting high every night just to say horrible things to you and cackle riotously, and you have to listen to the Grateful Dead the whole time, bootlegs of the Dead's live shows, so many non-variations because the Deadhead was the worst human and had a big stereo. Did I move out? No. Was I brave? No. Did I go back to New York City at the end of the spring and in some fucked up slow way re-embrace all the same problems and ills and scary-ass individuals that made me want to leave the city in the first place? You better believe it. 3. There are quotation marks at the beginning and the ending of this section. Being a poet is very much like has a lot to do with the way that little children make things. Children can make a game out of anything, and if you leave any special things lying around on the floor, the children will get them, and they'll put them, the milk bottle into the shoe, and paper bag crammed into the milk bottle, and they'll bring it over and say, look what I made. And you say, that's really terrific. That's really great. What is it? And then they say, I don't know. What is it? Unfortunately, most of you are not little children, and if you put the milk bottle in the shoe and the paper bag in the milk bottle, you'd be geniuses. But that isn't what you'll do. What you'll do is say, write down about 30 boring lines about your relationship with your mother or something, and then you'll bring it over and you'll say, look what I've made. And generally, most people will say, yeah, yuck. I can't believe it. God damn. Are you out of your mind? Why don't you go out and read Dante or something? Consequently, what you need to do, because it is very important when you make something to be able to show it to someone and have them say it is terrific, so that you will. I mean, it's necessary to get affection, love, a certain kind of understanding. It's also necessary to get encouragement, and it's necessary to be able to make a show. Like, for example, a peacock does. What? It goes like this. I mean, they just go up and say, look what I made. That's actually part of the important part, too. The peacock doesn't care, you know, the peacock comes up and goes like this, and you say, boring, man. Send me a guinea hen. 4, I might drop Newt Barr for Durbin. I kind of want to drop him and use the bench spot for a pitcher to hold. Is that wrong? That's tough. McNeil's projection is bad this week. You can't trust anyone who puts their seat all the way back. Con Ed rushes the penny. I'm only one cow away, and in particular, God, I want to just say, we love you, God. I don't, but we do, when we can't imagine what you're going through. One waits to say hello forever. Ribald hot spit on the tip of the hernia's hot spur, always on the mover's pavement, getting to move, but their health caring for you. The system unsees its own lack of how things howl. Knots leave wares unbuying. Cremation shows up as a result of sudden death, and that can't happen out of stride once the tubes get pulled from the throat. Mediocre gymnastics on the L train set to weaselly semi-beats. Steve would decry our use of adverbs, but if you heard the passing tunes, you'd conform to this monstrous usage indicative of poor character, and not only in the abstract, upon which one is asked to reflect getting out of bed, eyeing the latest hickey, a form of replacement star. If the drunk photographer needs company in bed, who will not emerge to take the charge? A crying blue octopi, tentacle-free, to keep taggers away. A notaire finally makes contact. Facts in assemblage, busy predicting the coming underground, the years they were born, the portraits of quixotic herons angrily dive-bombing the gulls in waiting. Inside, the station is freezing. Even the Galway hooker is no stage for warmth, so we watch these birds mimicking slums on the older tracks. I don't know where this comes from. I just set up cracks and named disciplines. I remember Qatar giving the president a picture plane. 5. Turns out if you run in circles with folks every day for months at a stretch, you can make friends. I wouldn't have put it that way at the time, but that's what I think happened to me when I was 15 and 16 in high school at the prestigious public, but you have to take a test to get in, Stuyvesant of the peg leg. Horrible. Worse than whatever Brando's Kurtz went through. I mean, nobody was filming me from the head down to hide my what, but just school. Okay, so I went from having 2 friends, Ulysses and Daryl, hi guys, to a bunch more, and some of their friends, and every day most of us would meet up after classes were done, but before homework had to be done, and go run in circles together. The cross-country team ran in non-circles sometimes, or longer non-circles. The reservoir at Central Park is a type of circle, but whatever those paths are in Van Cortlandt Park are not, and cross-country was a little more fun because we didn't have or need a coach. But track, indoor and outdoor, you run in circles, in incredible growing legions of pain, and you bond with the people you're running in circles with because you know it sucks, together, and you're supposed to be smart. So why are you subjecting yourself to this shit? And the other athletes on other teams at Stye and other schools don't respect you, and the coach maybe respects you if he's coming around, and your former teammates who bailed don't respect you but might pretend to, and no one watches or goes to the meets, and you won't still even go on a date until you're 3 years into college. But these are the names that I conjure when I need to remember, without knowing the need is even there when I remember who helped me start to become a person who could talk and get to know other kids and be something like happy again after some hard years. Wally, G, Danny, Carlo, Jen, John, Tito, Sumatra, Surendranath, Brian, Kathy J and Kathy M, Sylvia, Mike, Michael, James, Sumir, Mervyn, David Ree, Betty, Lyle, David Sy, Anthony, Waylon, Nancy, Noam, Wendy, Noel, Duncan, Coach Jacob Dennis. I have no idea where most of you are, other than in my heart, and this thing I call a poem. Last section. That said, we should have maybe let Trump nuke that hurricane, his first time around as president. It would have been catastrophic, but I don't think he'd have been reelected. I could be wrong, but I don't think you reelect the person who nukes the hurricane. We might is all I'm suggesting now. This is a forum here for imagination. Don't forget that before you freak out on me. However, elsewhere you might be, we might be better off with a nuked hurricane and no second Trump presidency. Now, I'm just sitting here talking out loud to myself and saying really amazing things, but it's weirding out the folks around me who are noticing that I'm just talking to myself. It's late, and I'm talking out loud to myself about how weird it would be to read everything someone ever wrote. I was thinking about Ron. I don't need to read what he just wrote yesterday or what he was writing when he was 15 and his dad was a bootlegger, though I would, but not for research, just out of curiosity, which might be the same thing sometimes, but not all the time. And Ron was reading French poetry by surrealists in translation, and maybe we have to acknowledge the French are so strange to the point where someone really bonkers like Magritte is just another guy for them. That's not true. I'm just thinking about Magritte, who was very much only who he had to be, and his mom died when he was young, and it makes me upset, but I also get it, but I can't be putting no hood over anybody's head, but I understand. And was he more of a fantast than a surrealist, as CC and PG posited in that unpublished interview I sent you, and maybe even made you read aloud from so we could talk about the difference between fantasy and enigma? Hi. I miss you too. Sort of. But really, surrealism is just a pathway to talking about baseball. The players will say it's really surreal when something cool happens and they have to talk about it live, because professional sports is just about the last live TV thing that goes on. And I'm sitting somewhere and I'm thinking, that's not surreal. That's a dream script turned into fate, turned into you. And there are no animal heads or pretend random breasts on your gear. But then for a kid who's 22 and just learning English in order to do a job that is a game that is really hard and demanding, but can pay well, but you have to go to weird places to work that you wouldn't likely choose to go hang out at, and then someone puts a mic in your face in front of 40,000 people and asks you how you feel, that could be called surreal. In the song Daisy Dukes, the rapper rhymes on with on. Look at those girls with the Daisy Dukes on. They really got it going on. I remember that. And I know I can do that because they did that and got a certain amount of mileage out of jean shorts worn by Catherine Bach in a show that came on before Dallas once a week that I used to watch with Mom and Eddie. Bobby dreamed a whole season. The Dukes drove a car named the General Lee. The cops were corrupt bumblers, but deep down there were supposed to be fragments of heart. Remember when Mike Tyson said everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face? All the sports writers did. Politicians borrow sports language all the time and don't know shit about sources. Sources don't always make it to the surface. Why should they have to? Do you remember last year? The jacket is furniture. I have to fix all the tools. Oh, Daddy, who can stand it? What a strange life. We keep saying things just to stay. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And everyone, good night. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being out there, and stick around. Enjoy the good company. Thanks.